hallelujah,
Hallelujah
belongs to you. A little louder.
Sometimes it takes a storm to help us realize that we are not in control, that we need the one who stills the waves and calms the wind, the one who formed this entire fragile planet, the one who is our life and the source of our strength. I don't know about you, but I prefer to be in control. Indeed, I assume that I have control most of the time. I have what I need to get me through a day. A little money in the bank, family I can turn to, insurance to protect my assets, a community on which to rely. And while it may be true that many of us have at least some of those resources, we all know, don't we, that that sense of control is, in the end, an illusion. Too many of us know how quickly our lives can be turned utterly upside down by illness, or job loss, or personal or community crisis, or a natural disaster like a hurricane that can shatter our sense of security and leave us storm-tossed and afraid. The residents of Puerto Rico know it all too well. When Hurricane Maria barreled down on that island just shy of a year ago, it wiped out an already vulnerable infrastructure, leaving the island without power and water and shelter. Perhaps some of you saw the recent study that the number of deaths caused by the hurricane may well have exceeded 4,600 lives. Many of those due to delayed health care in the months after the storm, when hospitals lacked the electricity and the resources they needed to care for those in crisis. 4,600 lives. That's a far cry from the official report that was sometimes in the tens, or perhaps just in the few hundreds. Nearly a year later, they are still trying to recover. We saw all those temporary blue roofs as we flew into San Juan, the ones that covered the roofs torn off by the hurricane gale winds. And while we didn't make it out to the countryside, where many Puerto Ricans remain without electricity, we heard about their continuing struggle from the residents of Ponce, where we worked for a week, painting a house and building a porch for Maria, preparing classrooms for the children of Ponce, replacing a destroyed kitchen floor that had collapsed for Martha, building a tool shed for the organization that hosted us. Listening to their stories, witnessing the natural beauty of the island and the scale of poverty and destruction, considering their vulnerability as we enter another hurricane season, I couldn't help but wonder, how do we weather the storms in our lives? When the boat is rocking, and the waves are crashing, and we fear for our very lives, what do we do? The disciples called out to Jesus, who was napping in the back of the boat, woke him from a sound sleep, begged him to help. And so he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stepped into the bow of the boat and told the wind to be still and the storm to cease. Wouldn't it be wicked cool if God would do that for us? Wave a hand and banish the storm. Stop it from coming altogether. Make everything better with the snap of a finger or a commanding word. Keep us all safe always. Only we know that's not how it works. The people of Puerto Rico know that God is in their midst, and yet that hurricane came, and the floodwaters did overwhelm, and the winds were indeed destructive. So maybe stopping the storm isn't what it's about. Maybe that's not even what Jesus did, really. Maybe Jesus didn't so much banish the storms as summon the peace. Still the waves just long enough for the disciples to get their balance in the boat. You see, we know it's not the last time that the disciples would be thrown off balance, not the last storm the disciples would have to weather, not the last time they would be tossed by the winds of fear or rocked by the pain of grief. This man who had called them from their nets, this man to whom they had given their lives and who they followed, their leader Jesus would in time be arrested and tortured and crucified. And the disciples would be called upon to be brave in the face of overwhelming hostility and ridicule. They would need to find their bearings again and again, and their courage if they were to begin to continue the work that Jesus called them to do. So maybe that's what Jesus meant when he urged them to trust God. Maybe Jesus knew what was up ahead, that there would be other storms. And so Jesus called them to trust, not that nothing bad would ever happen, but rather to trust that there is peace enough to see them, to see us through every storm. Perhaps when Jesus reprimanded the disciples, he wanted them to trust that God will indeed meet us right in the middle of the storm. Every day while we were in Puerto Rico, we invited our youth to look for evidence of God in the people we met, in one another, in small ways and in big ways. We asked them and ourselves over and over, where did you see God today? Now remember, this is a group of 50 people. Every day we had at least 50 responses to that question. We saw God in the joy that Martha exuded when she danced on that brand new kitchen floor. We saw God in Maria as she waved to us from her freshly painted front porch. And later when she introduced us to one of her homeless neighbors as we served lunch in the park. We saw God in the resilience of 80-plus-year-old sisters Lourdes and Carmen, who welcomed us into their living room and told us their story about weathering the storm, about feeding the birds and the cats that live in their neighborhood, about the folks for whom they pray every day who live out in the mountainside without electricity or a roof over their heads. We saw God in Lourdes and in Carmen. And we saw God in each other, in our own youth, as they welcomed each other. Many of them didn't know each other before this trip. Some were coming to get to know us just in the days prior to our departure. We saw God in the way that they navigated an unfamiliar culture, a language barrier. We saw them pray and laugh and work up a sweat to make a difference. We may have just scratched the surface, but we know that God was there in the midst of what we tried to do. And all of that makes me think that trusting God means trusting that God will show up when it gets hard. Sometimes God does indeed tell the winds to cease. God really does speak to the waves when we are in deep jeopardy. Sometimes, though, God will give us the extra dose of courage we need, or patience, or resilience, or a difficult life lesson, or kindness. Sometimes God sends us wise companions, people to call us out, to love us when we feel unlovable, to shake us from our fearful, paralyzed place. And sometimes, perhaps God just sits with us in our grief, or in our fear, or in our struggle, and offers us peace enough to ground us in a stormy sea. Peace enough to fortify us, to reassure us that though we cannot control the storms that come our way, neither do we need to navigate them alone. God, whose love is more fierce than any hurricane, more powerful than any wave, goes with us all the way through. Do you know it? I do. I have felt God's presence. I have felt God in my heart and witnessed God in the people around me. It is my prayer this day that you do too. Amen.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.